Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the core arguments of the book, The Rich Cheat and Become Richer. It makes a pretty bold case that huge wealth gaps aren't just some accident, but are actually a feature of our economic system, built that way by design. So let's pull back the curtain and see what that's all about.
So right off the bat, the source frames this whole discussion with a really powerful idea. This quote from Plutarch, the ancient Greek philosopher, is here to remind us that this whole debate about rich versus poor, it isn't some new political issue. Nope. It's a fundamental challenge that societies have been wrestling with for thousands of years.
So, to really get a grip on the problem as the author sees it, we have to look back. I mean, today's inequality didn't just pop up out of nowhere, right? It was built, piece by piece, over a long time.
The source kind of breaks recent history down into three big chunks. First, you've got the Gilded Age, right? Think massive fortunes, robber barons, and just huge inequality. Then, after the Great Depression and World War II, you see this period of shared prosperity. The book says policy changes really helped the middle class get a foothold and grow. But then, starting around the late 70s, things pivot into what the book calls the pulling apart era, where different policies apparently caused that inequality gap to just skyrocket all over again.
And wow, this number, it just puts that pulling apart era into such stark relief. The source points out that way back in 1820, the income gap between the world's richest and poorest was about 3-to-1. You can kind of wrap your head around that. But by 1991, it had exploded to 86-to-1. That is just a massive, seismic shift in how wealth is spread around the globe.
Okay, so this brings us to the core of the book's argument. And yeah, it's the most controversial part. The author claims the system itself has these built-in mechanisms that give a huge advantage to the wealthy, and the book just flat out calls them cheats. Let's see what it means by that.
Tax policy is basically Exhibit A here, and whoa, just look at this change. We're talking about the effective tax rate for the 400 wealthiest Americans. Back in 1961, it was over 43%. Today, it's just over 18%. The big point the book makes is that while wealth at the very top has ballooned, the actual tax burden on that wealth has been slashed by more than half. And hey, you don't just have to take the author's word for it. Here you have one of the richest men on the planet, Warren Buffett, saying loud and clear that his own tax rate is lower than the rates paid by the people who work for him. It's a really powerful statement that just shines a spotlight on how the system taxes money from a paycheck way differently than it taxes money from wealth.
And according to the source, the tax code is really just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Here we're seeing a few other advantages that are supposedly baked right into the system. You've got carried interest. That's a loophole that lets some of Wall Street's highest earners classify their pay as investment gains, which, surprise, surprise, get taxed at a way lower rate than a normal salary. The source argues that when you mix that with lobbying power and all these complex ways to avoid taxes, you end up with a system that has a very clear thumb on the scale.
All right, so let's flip the coin for a second and look at the other side of this. The author argues that being poor isn't just about a lack of money. The real kicker is that not having money actually costs you more money. The book calls this the poverty tax.
I mean, think about it. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, you might get slammed with overdraft fees. If you don't have a bank account, you have to pay a service just to cash your own check. If your car breaks down, you might be forced into a crazy high-interest payday loan. The point here is that these aren't just one-off expenses. They're like a whole web of little financial penalties that make it incredibly hard to climb out of poverty.
Okay, this is one of the examples from the book that really makes you stop and think, why on earth would poorer people pay more for something as simple as toilet paper? Well, it's because they often can't afford to buy in bulk at Costco or drive to the store with the best sale. They have to buy what they can afford right when they need it, and that usually means a higher price for each and every sheet.
And get this, here's another fascinating point the author brings up. According to the source material, the IRS actually audits people in the poorest counties more often than people in the wealthiest ones. And the reason? Apparently it's just easier. Auditing a wage earner is simple and quick. Auditing a massive corporation with offshore accounts and complex investments, that's incredibly difficult and super expensive. Okay, so after laying out all the problems, the book shifts gears and starts talking about some pretty radical solutions. And we're not just talking about tweaking a few tax rates here. These ideas are asking us to completely rethink what wealth even is and how it should work in our society. So to get this next part, you have to understand this key distinction the author makes between two different kinds of money. There's investment, like in the old school sense, funding a new business, creating something new. And then there's what the book calls stored wealth. That's when you park money in things that already exist, like stocks or real estate, and just let it grow in value, often without creating anything new for the rest of society.
And this chart, it kind of shows you exactly why that distinction matters so much. Between 1987 and 2013, the wealth of the super rich grew at 6.4% a year. That's way faster than the world economy grew and way, way faster than the average person's wealth. The author's point seems to be that these huge pools of stored money just grow bigger, faster than pretty much anything else.
So what's a potential solution look like? Well, here's probably one of the most radical ideas in the book, completely changing how we think about home ownership. The goal is to start treating a home as a place to live, not a lottery ticket. The idea is that you couldn't make a profit by selling your main home. Instead, any increase in its value, say because a new park or school gets built nearby, would be captured by the government and reinvested into the community that created that value. It's a huge shift from housing as a wealth-building tool to housing as community infrastructure.
And that really brings us to the final, challenging question that this book leaves us with. It pushes us to really think about what value even means. What if our entire economy was set up to reward the creation of new things instead of just the ownership of old things? What would that world actually look like? It's a huge question for sure, and definitely one worth chewing on.